In today's podcast, I wanted to talk about one of the big four accounting firm's former CEOs going on to CNBC to speak about vaccine mandates and the implications just across the board. And I think it's pretty interesting that CNBC chose to speak to a former CEO, and it was Mark Weinberger of EY, and he was the global CEO. And I think it's just because he's a friend of the host of CNBC. Otherwise, it just doesn't really make any sense. And his camera was terrible. His face was blotted out by the sun. But I think it was very interesting what he said, or maybe not the content of what he said, but the way he spoke about it, because it was very. He didn't want to go on one side or the other of whether companies should mandate a vaccine or whether they shouldn't. And he probably has a pretty good pulse on things because as a CEO of the big four accounting firms, you know the CEOs of the Fortune 500, or at least the biggest companies, and you've been in touch with them. They're your friends. They're your colleagues. You're still in contact with them. That's just part of being CEO of a big four accounting firm, or a really important partner at the big four accounting firms. But what I thought was interesting is he didn't want to get pinned on one side or the other. And he said it's very nuanced. And the CNBC host tried to nail him down on the best approach, but he really didn't want to be nailed down. And I'm sure he didn't want to put his former firm, into a weird situation. And the big four accounting firms are they're pretty quiet on this. Deloitte, we know, has already done the mandate for the US. But globally, I've been looking at their social media and stuff, and it's just not clear what they're doing overall. And they're not really saying one approach or another. They do so many studies and so many reports for everything else, from climate change. Like PwC is doing something in climate change for New York. Deloitte is teaching all their employees about climate change, but on this, they're being quiet because I think it's difficult to pick a side on where they're going to end up. But before we keep going, I wanted to tell everybody this episode is brought to you by Voomer. Voomer helps you ace the interview at the big four accounting firms, and it does this by providing you with AI-powered feedback to improve quickly. And this is for video interviews. And it actually gives you feedback, where most video interviews, you're not going to get any feedback before the interview. You have to practice with friends or other people, but this really will help you get AI-powered feedback. And there's different selections of different pricing selections with Boomer. And if you use the link in the show notes to this podcast, or the promo code BIG4, BIG, and the number 4, you can get 10% off your purchase. So back to the mandate topic. I think it's difficult to pick a side where things are going to end up. Like, a lot of employers are mandating it. The federal government in the U.S. is mandating it. A lot of governments around the world are trying to mandate it for their employees. But the former CEO of EY brought up some good points, that there's about 50% or more than 50% of people want the vaccine mandate. There's another that don't really care, and then there's 30% that do not want it at all. And he mentions that the 30% that doesn't want to manage at all, or he says a lot of those are lower income employees who don't want to work in that type of environment or don't want that mandate. But I think this is more implications broadly, because I think people are having difficulty finding employees. People are moving between jobs easier because of working at home. So people are riding the fence on this for the most part. Deloitte is not riding the fence on this as far as returning to work. But the former CEO of EY has brought up good points. Like, it's very nuanced. Some people, their doctors might advise them not to take the vaccine. Some people might have antibodies already, and they don't want to get the vaccine because their antibodies are really strong. There's a lot of nuance, and the CEO brought up a good point about that it's a very nuanced situation, and mandating it across the board is very difficult. And he says it's companies have to manage their risk one way or the other, because if you mandate it, then you might lose employees, or you might affect somebody that doesn't really want to get the vaccine, or you might lose some really good employees. But if you don't mandate it, then some employees might leave also because they want to they feel like they need protection, or some people might want to work from home if the vaccine isn't mandated, and there might be additional risk if somebody gets COVID in the workplace. So it's just a nuanced situation, and he brought that up, and I'm sure he advises E&Y a lot still, and so you can get some insight into what the big four accounting firms are thinking here, and I think it's going to continue to be a unique situation. And another article I recently saw too about employment was there's a lot of local governments, specifically in the U.S., but I'm sure it's everywhere, where due to inflation, having difficulty hiring people because of there's not enough money. They can't incentivize people enough to want to work for the government. So we have a very unique situation. Vaccine mandates, inflation, people moving jobs, people relocating, people not wanting to go back to in-person working. And it's just affecting workplaces very differently. And I think too, that's another thing I wanted to talk about, because the big four accounting firms deal a lot with governments, and they're going to deal a lot with regulators. But those regulators have some really lofty expectations in light of COVID-19 and all the stimulus money they've passed. But they also don't pay, and they don't move their pay as quickly as private employers. Yet they want to regulate everything. They want more taxes. They want more types of mandates. They want more just local regulations. They have more money now for local regulations, but they're going to have difficulty hiring enough people to fill those spots for various reasons, for the pandemic, for not being able to increase salaries fast enough, people moving around. So it's just, the job market right now is very interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going to happen within the big four accounting firms, but also with regulators of the big four accounting firm deals with. So be interesting to keep an eye on that. But that's the podcast for today. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast to get future updates, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Big Four Accounting Firms. Thanks for listening.